The hand axe. Before kingdoms, before armies, before anyone had thought to give a weapon a name, there was this. A gray-black piece of flint, roughly the size of a human palm, chipped along both edges into a teardrop point sharp enough to split skin, with almost no pressure. The hand axe is the oldest purpose-built killing tool in the archaeological record, with examples dated to approximately 1.76 million years ago, at sites like Kokosile in Kenya. And what makes that number genuinely staggering is that Homo sapiens didn't even exist yet. Homo erectus made these. The weapon predates our species entirely. What's equally remarkable is how long it stayed dominant. The Acheulean hand axe design remained essentially unchanged for over 1 million years, making it by an enormous margin the longest-serving weapon in all of human history. Nothing else comes close. The edges, when freshly knapped from obsidian, can reach a sharpness comparable to modern surgical steel, achieved through nothing more than one rock, striking another at the right angle. It was almost certainly used for both butchering animals and killing rivals, which means the line between tool and weapon was never really a line at all. This object represents a specific and chilling moment, the first time an ancestor looked at raw stone and decided deliberately to make it more dangerous. The spear. If the hand axe was the first weapon, the spear was the first revolution. The moment a sharpened point was attached to a long shaft, humans stopped needing to be within arm's reach to kill something, and that single change in geometry altered the entire trajectory of life on Earth. The oldest confirmed examples are the Schöningen spears, discovered in Germany and dated to approximately 400,000 years ago. 8 throwing spears carved from spruce wood, each nearly 2.3 meters long and balanced toward the front like a modern javelin, indicating their makers understood aerodynamics without having a word for it. Tipped with flint, bone, and later bronze or iron, the spear evolved continuously, while its core logic never changed. The real leap came with the atlatl, a short wooden lever that acted as an extension of the throwing arm, dramatically increasing both range and impact force. Estimates suggest it could launch a spear at close to 150 kilometers per hour, enough to punch through the thick hide of a mammoth. And that's where things get genuinely consequential. Historians and ecologists who support the overkill hypothesis argue that humans armed with spears and atlatls were directly responsible for the extinction of dozens of megafauna species, woolly mammoths, giant ground sloths, short-faced bears, as they spread across continents. The spear didn't just kill individual animals. It may have erased entire species from existence. Climate change was also a factor, and the debate continues, but the timing of human arrival and megafauna disappearance on continent after continent is difficult to dismiss. The composite bow. On the surface, a bow is just a bent stick with a string. The composite bow is something else entirely. Developed across the Eurasian steppes and documented in Egypt as far back as around 2800 BCE, it was built from laminated layers of wood, animal horn, and sinew. Each material chosen because it does something different under stress. The horn, placed on the belly of the bow facing the archer, stores compression energy. The sinew wrapped along the back stores tension energy. Together, glued under heat and then left to set for months, they release significantly more force than any single material bow could achieve at the same size. The result was a weapon short enough to fire from horseback, but powerful enough to punch through bronze armor at close range, with effective ranges that historians estimated up to 300 meters for skilled archers, though draw weights on some Mongolian versions reportedly exceeded 100 pounds and required years of training to use properly. This is what gave steppe nomads, Scythians, Huns, Mongols, a decisive and often insurmountable advantage over heavily armored infantry for thousands of years. The Mongol conquests of the 13th century, which resulted in the deaths of an estimated 40 million people and the destruction of entire civilizations, were built almost entirely on horseback archers, wielding composite bows with extraordinary skill. Armies that had never been beaten in open field combat simply could not close the distance before being reduced to casualties. The composite bow didn't just win battles, it reshaped the map of the world, the Roman gladius. Everything about the gladius looks wrong by modern instincts. It's short, a total length of roughly 60 to 85 centimeters depending on the variant, with a blade rarely exceeding 55 centimeters. Compact and almost stubby next to the longswords popular culture tends to associate with ancient warfare. But that was entirely the point. The gladius wasn't designed for individual duels. It was designed for the Roman manipular formation, where soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder in tight rows and the space to swing a long blade simply didn't exist. In that context, effects, the short stabbing thrust became lethally efficient. Roman military thinking, documented in sources like Vegetius, explicitly noted that even a shallow thrust to the abdomen was usually fatal, while a slash with a longer sword required significant force and rarely ended a fight immediately. A trained legionary could kill with a single controlled push and immediately reset behind his shield. Two main variants existed: the Mainz type, with a longer point suited for stabbing, and the Pompey type with a shorter parallel edge blade for faster thrusting. And between them, the gladius served as Rome's standard infantry sidearm, from roughly the 3rd century BCE through to the 3rd century CE. The territory conquered under its use stretched from the Scottish Highlands to Mesopotamia. What makes the gladius remarkable isn't any single property of the blade. It's that the weapon was deliberately designed to enforce formation discipline. Soldiers couldn't break ranks to swing it even if they wanted to. The weapon itself was a piece of tactical philosophy. The trebuchet. Before gunpowder changed everything, the trebuchet was the most destructive weapon a medieval army could bring to a siege. And it worked on a principle so simple it almost seems like a joke: gravity. A massive counterweight, documented examples weighed up to several tons, was dropped on one end of a long pivoting arm, and whatever sat in the sling on the other end went airborne at high speed. No stored tension, no twisted rope, no complex mechanism to fail in cold or wet weather, just a heavy thing falling and the physics that follow. Capable of hurling projectiles of 100 to 150 kilograms over distances approaching 300 meters with enough accuracy to strike the same section of wall repeatedly, the trebuchet turned castle fortifications, the defining defensive structures of the medieval world, into expensive liabilities. The Mongols carried disassembled trebuchets across Central Asia and reassembled them outside city walls, reducing fortified cities in Persia, China, and Eastern Europe that had held for centuries. In 1304, Edward I of England reportedly deployed a trebuchet nicknamed the War Wolf at the siege of Stirling Castle, described by contemporaries as the largest ever built, though precise dimensions were never reliably recorded. Perhaps most unsettling is how trebuchets were used offensively beyond stone. Contemporary accounts from the Siege of Kaffa in 1346 describe Mongol forces catapulting plague-infected corpses over the walls, an act many historians consider one of the earliest documented instances of biological warfare, though how directly it contributed to spreading the Black Death into Europe remains debated. The longbow. On the morning of October 25, 1415, at a field near the village of Agincourt in northern France, somewhere between 6,000 and 9,000 English and Welsh soldiers, exhausted, outnumbered, and weakened by dysentery, faced a French force estimated variously between 12,000 and 36,000, though historians still dispute the exact numbers. What happened next was largely decided by approximately 5,000 longbowmen and the physics of yew wood. A skilled archer with a longbow could fire 10 to 12 arrows per minute, and the bodkin arrowhead, a hardened steel point ground to a narrow square tip, was specifically engineered to concentrate force and punch through chainmail, and at close range even articulated plate armor. The longbow itself stood nearly as tall as the man drawing it, often close to 2 meters of pale yew, with draw weights ranging from 100 to 185 pounds, enough that the skeletons of medieval English archers show measurable skeletal deformities, enlarged left arms, and asymmetric shoulder development from decades of training begun in childhood. England didn't just encourage this training, it mandated it. Royal statutes required men and boys to practice on Sundays, essentially industrializing the production of archers as a national resource. The effective range of the weapon was approximately 180 to 270 meters, and at Agincourt the opening volleys effectively destroyed the French cavalry charge before it reached the English line. What followed was a rout. The longbow demonstrated something that military planners would keep failing to learn, that disciplined range firepower, delivered in volume, could defeat heavily armored opponents, regardless of social status or individual skill. Gunpowder artillery. On the morning of May 29th, 1453, walls that had protected Constantinople for over 1,000 years came down under the impact of enormous cast bronze cannons commissioned by the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II from a Hungarian engineer named Orban. The largest of these weapons reportedly fired stone balls weighing approximately 300 kilograms, and the walls of the city, which had repelled sieges from Persians, Arabs, and Vikings over the centuries, had simply never been designed to absorb that kind of repeated kinetic impact. The Byzantine Empire, which traced its lineage directly back to Rome, ended in a single siege. The cannon didn't invent gunpowder, as that came from China centuries earlier, but European military engineers developed artillery into a systematically devastating weapon, and the consequences spread far beyond Europe's borders. When Spanish conquistadors arrived in the Americas in the early 16th century, a small number of cannons combined with psychological shock allowed forces of a few hundred men to destabilize empires of millions. Naval warfare was transformed by heated iron cannonballs called hot shot, fired red from furnaces below deck, and capable of igniting wooden warships from within. By the 17th century, cannon foundries had become the most strategically critical industrial assets a nation could possess. Whoever controlled the metallurgy of artillery controlled the outcome of wars, which is why European powers spent enormous resources protecting and sabotaging each other's foundries. In a very direct sense, the cannon made the modern world, because it made every previous form of fortification and military organization obsolete nearly simultaneously. The flintlock musket. The flintlock musket was at its core a remarkably inefficient weapon, inaccurate beyond about 75 meters, slow to reload at roughly 3 rounds per minute under ideal conditions, prone to misfiring in wet weather, and requiring weeks of drilling before a soldier could use it with any reliability. None of that mattered because it didn't need to be accurate. It needed to be simple enough that a conscripted farmer could learn to operate it, cheap enough to manufacture by the thousands, and lethal enough that a massed line of trained soldiers firing in controlled volleys produced a wall of lead that nothing in melee range could survive.
The British Army's Brown Bess, officially the land pattern musket, remained in continuous service from approximately 1722 to 1838, over a century of active use across every major conflict the Empire fought, making it one of the most enduring standardized military firearms in history.
At Waterloo in June 1815, the final major engagement of the Napoleonic Wars, massed musket fire from infantry lines engaged at ranges under 50 meters produced casualty rates that would have been inconceivable to armies fighting a generation earlier. The deeper significance of the flintlock is what it did to military hierarchy. A peasant with 2 weeks of training and a loaded musket could kill a knight who had trained since childhood. It didn't just change how wars were fought. It started dismantling the entire social logic that had justified aristocratic military dominance for centuries. The Maxim gun. Hiram Maxim demonstrated his invention in 1884, and the principle was elegant in a way that made its consequences almost hard to process. Previous guns required the shooter to manually operate a mechanism between shots. Maxim's design used the energy of the recoil from each fired round to automatically eject the spent cartridge and chamber the next one, allowing continuous fire as long as ammunition was fed into the weapon. The result was approximately 600 rounds per minute from a single gun, requiring a crew of just a few men. At the Battle of Omdurman in Sudan in 1898, a British force of around 8,000 soldiers, supported by roughly 20 Maxim guns, killed approximately 10,000 Sudanese soldiers in a matter of hours, while suffering fewer than 50 dead themselves.
One of the most asymmetric battle outcomes in recorded history. But the real reckoning came during the First World War, when European commanders applied 19th century infantry tactics against machine guns and barbed wire that had been specifically designed to stop exactly those tactics.
On July 1st, 1916, the first day of the Battle of the Somme,
the British Army suffered approximately 57,470 casualties.
Killed, wounded, and missing in a single day, largely because massed infantry advancing across open ground ran directly into entrenched machine gun positions. Every major tactical innovation of the First World War, tanks, creeping artillery barrages, coordinated air support, infiltration tactics, was fundamentally a response to the problem the Maxim gun created. It didn't just kill people. It forced the complete reinvention of how armies fought. The tank. The tank arrived on a battlefield for the first time on September 15th, 1916 at the Somme, and the soldiers who saw it had no framework for what they were looking at. A steel box, roughly the size of a small house, grinding forward on tracks across ground that would have stopped any wheeled vehicle, absorbing rifle and machine gun fire without slowing, crushing barbed wire flat, and crossing trenches that had stopped infantry advances for 2 years. The earliest models, the British Mark Waffern, moved at roughly 6 kilometers per hour and broke down frequently. But the psychological impact on German defenders who encountered them for the first time was documented in multiple accounts as total panic. The weapon matured quickly. By the Second World War, the German Tiger I carried armor plating up to 120 millimeters thick, and a gun capable of destroying enemy vehicles at ranges of 1,500 meters or more, while the Soviet T-34, arguably the most consequential tank of the war, combined reasonable armor with a top speed approaching 53 kilometers per hour, and was produced in numbers exceeding 84,000 units. The German military doctrine of blitzkrieg, which collapsed France in approximately 6 weeks in May and June of 1940 by bypassing fortified lines and driving armored columns deep into undefended rear areas faster than headquarters could respond, was built almost entirely around concentrated tank use combined with air support. The tank ended the static, grinding war of attrition that had defined the Western Front and made rapid territorial conquest possible again, which, depending on who was doing the conquering, was either a tactical revolution or a catastrophe, the atomic bomb.
At 8:15 in the morning on August 6, 1945,
a single bomb dropped from a single aircraft detonated approximately 600 meters above the city of Hiroshima, Japan. The device, nicknamed Little Boy and carrying a yield of approximately 15 kilotons of TNT, produced a flash of white light visible from over 50 kilometers away, followed by a fireball reaching temperatures of several million degrees Celsius at its core, followed by a pressure wave that collapsed reinforced concrete buildings within a radius of roughly 1.6 kilometers and shattered windows nearly 20 kilometers distant. Approximately 70,000 to 80,000 people died in the initial blast and firestorm. By the end of 1945, accounting for radiation sickness and injuries, estimated total deaths reached to somewhere between 90,000 and 166,000. Historians note the range reflects genuine uncertainty, not imprecision. 3 days later, a second bomb, Fat Man, with a yield of approximately 21 kilotons, destroyed Nagasaki. What followed wasn't just the end of the Second World War, it was the creation of a new category of weapon, one where a single device carried by a single crew could erase a city, and where any nation possessing enough of them could threaten the existence of human civilization. At the peak of the Cold War arms race in 1986, global nuclear stockpiles reached an estimated 70,000 warheads. The atomic bomb didn't just change warfare, it created a world in which the possibility of human extinction became a permanent feature of geopolitics, and every major international conflict since has been shaped, at least partly by awareness of that fact. The ICBM, the Intercontinental Ballistic Missile, is the only weapon in this list that has never been used in combat, and that is precisely what makes it the most dangerous thing ever built. First developed by the Soviet Union with the R-7 rocket in 1957, the same vehicle that launched Sputnik, the ICBM can deliver a nuclear warhead to any point on Earth in approximately 25 to 30 minutes from launch, faster than most governments can convene a decision-making meeting, let alone agree on a response. Modern variants like the Russian RS-28 Sarmat are reportedly capable of carrying up to 10 or more independently targetable warheads, known as MIRVs, meaning a single missile launch could simultaneously destroy multiple cities across an entire continent. Though Russia's published specifications for the Sarmat should be treated with appropriate caution given their source, the entire strategic logic of the Cold War, mutually assured destruction, or MAD, rested on ICBMs. The idea that if both sides could always survive a first strike and retaliate in kind, neither side would ever rationally choose to strike first. It was deterrence through guaranteed annihilation, and it held, though not without alarming near misses. On September 26, 1983, Soviet Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov received an early warning alert indicating that the United States had launched 5 nuclear missiles toward the Soviet Union. The protocol required him to report upward immediately, triggering a retaliatory launch. He judged it a false alarm, correctly, as it turned out, and did not report it. The ICBM is the endpoint of every weapon on this list, the culmination of 1.7 million years of humans making things sharper, faster, and more lethal, arriving finally at an object whose entire value as a weapon depends on the hope that it is never actually used. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.